So again, welcome to our webinar today. This is part of a series of monthly webinars that we're doing on critical topics in sales training and sales education. As many of you know, my company is science-based, and we look at the critical issues in mortgage originations from an analytical component. As you know, our assessments reflect that approach and also our training side of it. So today we're going to talk about the biggest mistake in sales training, what works in sales training, what really changes sales results, and of course the 7 keys to delivering effective sales training. So let's talk about the biggest mistake in mortgage sales training, and I don't have to tell you it's used at many companies, and that's an approach that Neil Rackham, who is the author of Spin Selling, talks about a lot in his variety of different famous books. It's really an entertainment approach, and that's an approach of, let's motivate the field, let's look at what pearls of wisdom we can share with them, and then we hope that they remember, and we hope that they will implement these pearls that are given to them when they basically go back into their office. But the research, as Neil Rackham has shown, is that when you look at what was learned 120 days forward, not much, and not much is really remembered. So the entertainment approach, although it's quite common in mortgage sales, reality of it is, especially with today's more difficult market, that we need a better approach to sales training, and that's what we're going to talk about today, about what works. Neil Rackham also talks about the approach needs to be an approach that is what he calls a healthcare approach, where similar to a doctor, we do some analytics, we figure out what actually is the issue, and then we present something that's tailored to the individual originator in our case. So again, the entertainment mode has been quite common in mortgage banking, but I think the reality of it is that we do know that when you go back and you test, how did this improve the individual originator's performance, you really do not have a very good success rate with it. So what is working in sales training? Well, it really does boil down, and certainly what our research shows, that before you can sales train, you really are looking at 3 issues. The first is, can the person do the job? Now, what we're talking about is, and this is where pre-hire assessments come in at this point, we're talking about a talent evaluation. If the person can't do the job, there's no sales training that's going to improve the person's results. Again, you can't motivate somebody to now do differently an activity if they, in fact, don't really have that talent set. So first step is, to evaluate, can the person do the job? Now, if they can do the job, the second part is, will they do the job? Well, that's the evaluation of, and this certainly does apply from a training perspective, is the person willing to commit to make a change? So, A, do they have the talent? B, are they willing to make a change? Again, if those first 2 steps aren't there, the issue is not sales training. The issue is a much deeper issue, that you have somebody that's not matched for the job. And then the third part, and this is where sales training comes in, is, again, does the person know how to do the sales process? And this is where training is obviously the method to implement a methodology. And we'll talk in depth what that should look like. In particular, how does the manager, the local manager, whether they are branch, regional, or divisional, how does the manager install really a training culture? Again, we have to look at the big picture, and what makes sales training very difficult is that obviously at its heart, it's about changing somebody's behaviors or knowledge. And as a result, it's not easy, and especially when you're dealing with adults. Reality of it is that it requires thought, it requires effort, and a process being really put in place. And the reality of it is that it's very important that the local manager be the competent trainer of the sales skills that are needed to be successful in mortgage origination. The training department, in my view, is really the group that organizes the subject matter experts, puts the material together, and in other words, applies organizational psychology components to it, but the local manager still is responsible for implementing sales training at the branch level or regional or divisional level. There's really only two ways to change results, and this is very important for anyone that is in a senior manager role, is to recognize, and this is where the entertainment event approach doesn't work, is that to change, you have to change the knowledge or you have to change the behaviors. What we're going to talk about today is the knowledge part. We will talk about coaching and how to do it effectively the next webinar that we are doing. So what are the 7 keys to developing an effective sales training approach? One is certainly to perform an analysis. Again, we're looking at what is the learning gap. And the second part is to develop and recognize that your students have different learning styles, and we'll talk about that in a second. Link training to performance. Again, what makes adults difficult to teach is that it really has to be tactical to what's going to make them do it more effectively now. So training has to be linked to what is the particular individual's learning gap. The use of the PowerPoint and workbooks, where they fall, how do you measure the objectives for the training, and the practice and reinforcement part is so critical to ensure that the habit is really developed. And then obviously the final component is what worked and what did not work in putting the sales training together. So when you look at performing the analysis, and a lot of times where the failure of sales training really centers is the first part isn't really done. Because you really have to look at, and again, this is why event training, where you're throwing people into a class and you're expecting everybody to have the same problem, and if you use the rule of thumb, do they walk out with just one pearl of wisdom? Well, that's really not going to change your sales results if that's what your goal is to do. So what we are saying to you is that you really have to look at it at the individual level. What does that person know and what don't they know? And then target and develop and design the sales training to address that person's individual needs. Many times in mortgage banking, we think just because the person is seasoned or a veteran, that really doesn't mean that they are trained in today's what's required for prospecting, what's required for closing. In other words, the whole consultative process, we can't assume that just because the person's been 20 years in the business, that the person can basically execute it effectively for today's customer. And I think a lot of times with mortgage companies, this is the first problem, that we assume just because they came from a named bank or they've been in it a long time, we're assuming that they are trained, and that certainly is not the case. So when you're targeting the analysis side of it, what do they know and what don't they know, there's really only a couple approaches that you can do. First is to observe. Observation is obviously very effective, but does require you as a manager to do ride-alongs, to be actually in the field. And when you have a larger group of people, that can be somewhat difficult. The other step is this is where assessment testing can come into play. You can actually measure what do they know about the consultative selling process. About 3 years ago, we studied this very issue of what do originators know. We invited a variety of different companies to participate, and we developed a questionnaire that is 80 questions that we are, in essence, having that individual complete a questionnaire, and then we're measuring where did they fall with how top producers answered the questionnaire regarding consultative selling process. And the point of it, and what the goal of it was to help in this training issue of finding out what does the individual need for training, because it may not be what you think. And this is what the challenge is that we really need to know at an individual level if we're going to change sales results. So as you can see in this slide, there are 8 parts that we measure, and This will be no surprise, I think, to many of the managers and individuals on the call today, that when you look at the consultative sales side of it, from prospecting all the way down to closing, what is the number one topic? Although this slide indicates it is first meeting, but what we see in the research that on average, originators do not understand what they need to do from prospecting. By far, prospecting is the number one sales training issue that companies and managers would be wise to really implement and emphasize. Prospecting, for sure, in the past, it wasn't as required because of refis, but certainly now, when we're saying get out there and prospect, you really cannot assume that they know what they're supposed to do in the prospect arena today, which is much different than it was in the past. I wrote an article about this particular issue about knowing and understanding the sales knowledge side of it that was in an MBA article called Sales IQ. And if you're interested in it, just email me at Sherlock at QFS Consulting, and I would be glad to send you what we found. But again, the net result of it is that on a scale of 1 to 10, that we found that originators, the prospecting sales knowledge part, was the weakest by far. And certainly I would suggest that would be a topic that as a manager that you would be emphasizing because, again, each individual is different, but as a whole, that's a topic in consultative selling that most originators do not know. So once you understand what the individual has a learning gap in, the next part of it is to actually customize to the individual how they learn. A lot of times sales training programs really don't work because of the issue of, is the person visual, is the person auditory, or is the person kinesthetic? Those three things translate into presenting sales training in a seeing, hearing, and feeling component. And what that really means is that too many times we assume if we just whip out a PowerPoint that that's going to be enough. It is enough for those that are visual, that learn through seeing, but it's not enough for those that learn through auditory, which is they need to hear. And finally, those that do neither of those would be the individuals that, in other words, have to feel things and touch things. And those are people that like demos and like role plays and so forth. So all training needs to be really designed, if you don't know the individual's learning style, in the format of a seeing component, a hearing component, and a feeling component. A quick way, and a lot of times what we do with our own sales training, is that there are many different assessments that are free on the web that would really give you an insight to what your audience is about, and I would suggest that you really, tap into them. But certainly you can ask the individual employee how they like to receive their training, and they certainly will tell you. But again, all training needs to have a component of seeing, hearing, and there's certainly feeling. The third part of effective sales training is obviously linking it to performance level. What happens in sales training many times, and certainly I see this often enough, is that the training is dumbed down. We have some people in the individual side of it who may be not as well versed on a topic. Then we have others. And so what ends up happening, the trainer, and if you are a manager, ends up dumbing down to the lowest common denominator. Again, what we really need to do is group people into where they are from a skill set level. So we are providing training that is essentially matched to that individual level. And obviously this dovetails to the issue about practice and how we design our role plays and case studies and so forth when we're showing how to implement things. Too often, and I'll speak about this in a second, is that when we do role playing or whatever we're designing as the implementation side of it, we end up, again, dumbing it down, and that really doesn't help anybody be successful and learn something new. But reality of it is the person is an adult, and they bring to the plate experience. And so you have to really recognize where they are at their experience level, in addition to recognizing that they do come with a vast level, especially in mortgage banking, of many years of experience in the business. And again, you know, the real question is that where you're trying to improve performance, you're using training as a way to close the gap in their learning issue and address it to what will be important to them from an execution level and a result level. By far, again, I would tell you, in my experience, what I see is the prospecting side is for sure the weak link in mortgage banking, and people do not make enough effort in teaching how to do it in today's marketplace, which is much, much different. Fourth part of sales training is, again, what's so wonderful about the technology today is that you have to have reinforcement that tie together with the person's learning style. And the person's learning style, as we've already said, if they're a visual person, they're going to love PowerPoint. And again, the whole business world, including everyone in mortgage banking, loves PowerPoint. So that problem is not an issue, but when you're coming out with material for the student or your employee, you're talking about having podcasts, a way that they can learn through listening. The auditory people need to see that. And then the people that are your kinesthetic individuals, you know, they're people that, again, well-designed role-playing really helps them grasp the material and in essence, implement it. So I will tell you one thing that the research does show, and as a whole, from a business standpoint, is that many business people are basically visual, and so the PowerPoint may be sufficient, but in reality, that only represents 2/3 of the individual. So there's another third. If you don't have the auditory or you don't have the role-playing / demo component, they're really not, they'll nod their head, but they're really not grasping anything. So you need to, in essence, incorporate that when you're doing your training. The fifth part of effective training is measuring the objectives. What will the student, how will we know that the student has learned? A lot of times with sales training, we just assume it's some type of feel-good component, when it really is, there are certain techniques, certain methods, and certain processes that the individual needs to grasp. Again, you can do it through an observational component where you're observing how the person, when you're doing ride-alongs or whatever, but there's also another way that you can use assessment testing to really measure, did they learn what was taught? And there should be a fail component if they didn't learn that. So two methods. Assessment testing can be one way for you to measure whether they have learned, but obviously the person's performance. If you've taught prospecting and the individual has not done any prospecting, there's a problem for sure. And that would be an indication that whether the training didn't work or we're circling back to a talent issue. The sixth part is enforcement. To have an effective sales training, you have to have a component that is really where the student or your employee can practice the new information that's being taught to them. Too often what ends up happening is that there's no practice. There's just an individual, if you're a manager, pontificating on how you did it when you were a loan officer. That's wonderful and historically interesting, but it's not going to change the performance of the individual loan officer. What's going to change the performance is that the teacher, if you're the manager, is someone that is watching the behavior being demonstrated that it's been learned. Again, if you look at the research, it's clear. It's not only clear in sports, but in business and in music, that practice does make perfect, and that includes sales training. And it's not enough just to tell somebody how to do it. It's more, what you have to have is an adoption of a habit, which is a behavior that now the person's going to use. I would tell you just from our own experience, what I see when I'm training in the field, is that many individuals, again, when they're doing training, it's one way where they're too passive and the individual themselves never gets an opportunity to demonstrate what they're doing. With technology such as, you know, webcams and podcasts, in other words, there's many vehicles today that really shouldn't be ignored and should be used by the manager when they are determining let the student practice to show what they're capable and what they have learned and what they need help on. If you look at sports, we know that you can't play golf just being somebody good at miniature golf. You have to maybe start with miniature golf, maybe you go to the practice range, but you're going to get out on the course at some point, and that part is, again, really reflective of what happens with sales, that we need sales to be divided into topics and basically piecemeal to the individual, and then they have to show an expertise in it. We're coming out with a video role-playing system where the originator can actually sit at their home and use their PC. So we're quite excited about that because we think that adds the missing part with a lot of sales training where there's really no practice component to it, and certainly, and that's why a lot of the training never gets really adopted. So the practice and reinforcement has to be part of any sales training that you're doing. And finally, as any trainer or any instructor or any teacher will tell you, training always is centered on what worked and what didn't work. There are many ways to get that. Obviously, you can see if the training was effective, performance should improve. If the performance doesn't improve, it's either that the talent wasn't there and it wasn't really a training issue, or the issue is that the training class wasn't targeted enough to what was the individual needs that person might have. So certainly feedback from the student, certainly they will give that. You can also obviously see it from performance. And certainly there are 360s that really measure how well the manager is coaching and developing others. I know that that's a competency that we have in our 360s, is that you're having the individual people that the manager is coaching and developing, and they're rating them on 7 to 8 type of issues, and that can be a clear indication of how well the training and developing was being performed at the manager level. So to summarize today, we're talking about the evaluation at the originator level really centers on 3 issues. Can they do it? And that's, again, the evaluation is, does the person have the talent to be an effective originator, whether they're retail or wholesale? It really doesn't matter. So that component occurs in the interview stages. The next part of it, will they do it? It's not enough to know if the person has talent. The purpose really of an interview that's effective is to determine, where is that person now? Are they willing to make a commitment to produce in a way that they talk about, or are they willing to make a change? I would say with many originators today, it is requiring them to change their prospecting model. And are they willing to do that? Because if they're not, training, again, would not be the solution set. But the third part is, do they know what to do? And that's really something that the manager and the company needs to really put in place from the standpoint that, is there a certain process? The phone's answered in one way. Is the issue of how we handle a customer, how we go through that process. That's the role of where sales training comes into play, where we are organizing in a systematic way the effect of how it works to be effective as an originator. So again, what we talked about today is that there are 7 really keys to being an effective trainer. Again, assuming that the person has the talent, willing to do it, then certainly it is a training issue, and a training issue that if the manager follows the keys talked about would really improve the sales results of their individual originators and team.